Good evening, everyone, and welcome on in to Bible Basics class. We are in here tonight. See everybody jumping in. Of course, as you jump on in the room, make sure you swipe to the right and click share so you can send this out to all your friends and followers so that they know we are in Bible study tonight. We're going to have a good time as we recap what we've learned so far. As you come in, make sure you leave a comment. Let me know who you are, where you're watching from. If you're from New Psalmist, let me know. If you're from another church, let me know that, who your pastor is, what state you're watching from, and we'll give you a quick shout out as we get going in our class tonight. We're going to have a good time. See you guys jumping in. I'll make sure I'm sharing this on all my social media sites and everything so everybody knows we are live tonight in the break room. Hey, what's up? We got a couple new Psalmist members in the room with us tonight. Going to a great time. Yeah, from Towson, alrighty. MPBC, greatest church in America, in the world. Hey, Deja, hope all is well. Casey, also watching from New Psalmist. We got some millennials from Cali, alrighty. House of Purpose. Glad you're on from the other side of the country. Glad you're in with us. Hey, Shelba, glad to see you tonight right here in the Bible study classroom for our Bible Basics class. I'm excited about the message tonight. Yep, another member. Whoop, whoop. All righty, I see you. Hey, Chauncey, hope all is well. Hey, Danielle, you're from New Psalmist, currently at your computer taking a break from studying. All righty, good. I'm glad there's a good little break for you. Hey, Candace, my wife is on in discipleship class. Hopefully she won't get in trouble, but Miss Aviti don't write her up for coming on in the room with us tonight. Good evening. All right, from Atlanta, Georgia. Amen. All the way from the great city of Atlanta. Go down to Atlanta pretty often. I haven't been in about 2 years. I think Candace, we need to make a trip to Atlanta just because, Atlanta's a great city, great place to go just on GP. All right, Sylvia Willis from Williamsburg, Virginia. All righty. Hey, Stacy, glad you're in with us tonight. We're going to get ready to get rolling in a little bit, but as you come in, of course, make sure you swipe to the right, send out to all your friends and followers that you are in the Bible study room tonight. Abe, the baby girl, she is asleep. She went to sleep early today, so I'm glad. I had about 30, 40 minutes to get myself together. She went right down, so I'm shouting on that. But make sure you swipe, sending it out, sharing it, and then also tap the screen, send up the hearts. If you enjoyed this Bible study, send it up even throughout the lesson. You can keep sending up those hearts. We want to fill the screen with the hearts, have it almost explode from so many hearts up so that everybody sees we're having a good time tonight. Couple of things we've got going on. I want to make sure you guys are aware of all that's happening here for the Millennial Ministry at New Psalmist. We will be having our second happy hour of the year on April the 15th. So all millennials, that's ages 18 to 33, we're having our second happy hour on April the 18th right at the church. It's a free event, but the ticket, you just need a ticket. And to get your tickets, you can go to M2HH, caught dropped off, caught but that's a good catch. M2HH.eventbrite.com. That's M2HH.eventbrite.com. Get your free ticket so that we know how many to expect and how many will be joining us in the happy hour on April the 15th. It's going to be a great time of sharing. We're going to have fun, just talking about what's going on in all of our lives. Our last happy hour, we had some great conversation. And this one, we're going to follow up great conversation, great time to hang out, meet some other millennials at the church, and see what's going on in some other people's lives and see what some other people are thinking. All right, oh yes, from down, hey Stacy, hope all is well from People's Church down in Silver Spring with Dr. Haywood Robinson. So that is April the 15th. You can get your tickets today. The tickets are going fast. We already have 40 tickets that have already been allocated for the event. So it's going to be a great time. So I encourage you to make sure you get your ticket ASAP so that you can join us on that evening and just having a great conversation, talking about a lot of topics that millennials are dealing with. And as I mentioned Sunday, to all those who came to the let out, we had a great time after each service, after 7:15, 9:30, and 12 o'clock. On June the 3rd, we are going to have a special event just for millennials. More information is coming soon, but I just want you to mark your calendar now for June the 3rd. It's going to be in the evening. It's going to be fun. You guys are really going to enjoy this. I'm not going to give too much of the information away yet because I want to make sure you guys stay connected so you know what's happening. So thus some of the things coming up with the millennial ministry at the church. Also want you guys to know on this coming Sunday, we will be celebrating Bishop Walter Scott Thomas Sr.'s 41st pastoral anniversary as the pastor of the New Psalmist Baptist Church. It's exciting. For 41 years, he has been leading the church. 41 years he has served as the pastor. And on Sunday, we will celebrate his 41 years of pastoral ministry, pastoral leadership. It's going to be a great time. So I hope that you guys can come on out, join us all day long, 7:15, 9:30, and 12 o'clock. Dr. Lance Watson from Richmond, Virginia is going to be our guest preacher. He is a dynamic man of God, so I hope to see you there Sunday as we appreciate our pastor, Bishop Thomas, for all that he's done and all that he is continuing to do. And if you want, you can bring your tokens of appreciation, your gifts of love to Bishop. If you've been blessed by his ministry, bring a card, bring a gift, let him know just how much his ministry has blessed you and changed your life. So that'll be this coming Sunday all day long. Alrighty, so let's jump on in. Last week we finished off the book of Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah together, which took us completely through the books of history. And today's session we're going to recap over what we've done so far, what we've seen, what we've studied, what we've learned, and from all the way from Genesis right on through Nehemiah as we prepare ourselves to go into the next phase of this Bible study. So, of course, as we go along today, we're not going to be long in our session today, but if you have any questions at all, any things that have come up that you have questions about from things we've studied as we've gone through these first two sets of books in the Bible, of chapters in the Bible, we had the books of law, and now we've gone through the books of history. Any questions you have, just send them up on the screen as I'm going. I'll do my best to catch them and answer them as we go along. But we're just going to kind of recap for anybody who jumped in late as we had already began our Bible study sessions back in October. Just want to make sure you have an understanding of where we are so that as we continue to go and build upon that, everybody's on the same page. So we started off in the book of Genesis. The first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are known as the books of law, also known as the Torah, also known as some scholars will even refer to them as the books of Moses, the Pentateuch. So they're the first 5 books that give us that foundation that set us up upon everything that we go from is built off of these first 5 books. In these books, we start off, you know the story, Adam and Eve. The creation story. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We have the creation of the world, and then we have the creation of man. We see Adam and Eve. God gives them dominion over the world, and the serpent comes and causes them and tricks them and deceives them to eat from the tree of life. The only thing that they were told not to do, they indeed do. And in doing it, sin enters into the human race. We spent a lot of time talking about sin and the entrance of sin and how it now has permanently stained humanity. Because as you notice, as we've been studying, sin is a continual theme. Sin doesn't go away. As we continue to study through the Bible, we will continue to see the impact and we'll see the effects that sin has on all humans. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of Jesus Christ. We see that and we continue to go on and on. When we get to the New Testament, we have a remedy for sin, but that remedy does not take away as far as stop us from sinning, but rather it covers us in our sin. That's Jesus Christ. We'll talk more about that in depth as we get into the New Testament further on in this Bible study class. But sin has come in through Adam and Eve in the garden by doing what God told them not to do. And sin is simply missing the mark. That's the simple and easiest definition for sin, is when you do not do things correctly in accordance with the plan that God has for your life. So that is what sin is, and we continue to see it permeated throughout the human race, and it comes up in different forms. In the book of Genesis, we see family strife. We see constant conflict within families, whether it's Cain and Abel, then whether it's Jacob and Esau, then whether it's Joseph and his brothers. we continue to see this theme of how sin has an impact in family life and how sin causes there to be splits in family units. So that is one impact of sin. Then as we get further on and we start to see the sin of not trusting, not fully relying on God with the Israelite people as God brings them out of captivity. He sends 12 spies in to see the promised land. They don't believe that they can get it. And because of that, they doubt God. They sin against God, and God makes them wander for 40 years in the wilderness. We continue to see the impacts of sin. Then as we get instruction, as God begins to formalize his covenant through laws, through the 10 Commandments and other guides that he gives, we see sin as breaking those commands, whether that's building golden calves, whether that's serving other gods. We continue to see the impact of sin in now different ways, different shapes, and different forms. So that is a major point that we get out of the books of law, the origins of sin, and we begin to see how sin has shaped and stained humanity and shaped and stained the God's chosen people, and oftentimes blocked them from fully entering into what it was that God had for them. That's a key thing to understand with sin in our Old Testament understanding. This will add more to it, and it'll evolve, and we'll build upon it when we get to the New Testament and bring our theology about Jesus into it. But from the Old Testament understanding, and it's important that we understand this, because without understanding it, one, we don't understand the full magnitude of what Jesus came to do and what Jesus did for us, but we also miss out on understanding the world in which they lived. So sin continues to block them from fully getting everything that God had for them. We see it with Adam and Eve. First, hey, we got someone from New York. Glad you're in with us. The Big Apple, NYC. Glad you're in with us in Bible study. So we see sin as blocking Adam and Eve from having dominion over everything. God gave them everything. He gave them dominion over everything. Everything was theirs, under their subjection. But because of sin, they lost all of it. We continue to see it as it goes further and further. We see it with the children of Israel who have come out of captivity, hey, welcome from South Carolina. They've come out of captivity. God has a promised land for them, but because of sin, because of doubt, because of sin not trusting in God, they forfeited, and for an entire generation, they wander in the wilderness. Pittsburgh, glad you're in with us. So we see a trend that sin blocks from entering fully into what it is that God has for you. We see it even with Moses, some great figures, Augusta, Georgia in the house. With Moses, God has picked Moses, selected Moses to be the one to lead his children out of captivity and into the promised land. But Moses sins by not trusting God fully, and not trusting God fully from the perspective of he gets frustrated with the people and he does not do what God told him to do. Instead, he tries to do it on his own. And because he does that, Moses misses out on leading the children of Israel into the promised land. God takes him up on Mount Nebo, shows him everything, but says, you're not going to get there with him. I'm going to show it to you, but you can't be the one to lead them across the Jordan River into the promised land. So we continue to see how sin blocks, how sin stops people from accessing and entering into fully what it is that God has for them. So that's the first thing we see. And we see it in the book. It begins in the books of the law. So, the books of the law give us the origins of the creation of the world. They also give us the origin of sin and the impact that sin has had on some of these founding figures, as we see in our religion. But they also give us the story in the first covenant, the covenant that God makes with Abram, that if Abram follows God's commands and does what God tells him to do, then he will make his descendants as numerous as the sand on the beach, on the shore, that he will have descendants for days, that he will be the one through whom God establishes his line, God makes his promise, and God will always watch out and protect those that fall in that lineage. We see that covenant made with Abraham, with Abram, then Abraham, through his son Isaac. That's important. Abraham had 2 sons, but the covenant established through Isaac, through the line of Isaac, not through the line of Ishmael. Isaac is the son of Abraham and Sarah, formerly known as Abram and Sarai. So we see that the initial establishment of this covenant. Still, we see it as God tells Abraham to go up to on the mountain and says, you're going up on the mountain and you're taking your son with you and you're going to sacrifice him to me. And Abraham does what God tells him to do. And right before he goes to kill his son, God has a ram in the bush. He tells him, don't touch the boy. And God says, because you have trusted in me fully, that seals, that was the last piece of it. It sealed, it showed that Abraham fully trusted in and relied on God. And through that, God says, okay, now I'm going to bless you and bless all your descendants from this point on. So we see that covenant comes through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, down through all the descendants. And we see, to kind of give you a little hit, anybody who missed out on some of the lessons with us, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's 11th son was Joseph. Joseph was cast off by his brothers, sold into slavery. He ends up, after going through Potiphar's house, he ends up in Egypt. And in Egypt, he is given dominion and command over all of the palace. As the famine comes on the land, he stores up. His family comes from the Canaan. They've chosen the promised land, the land that God has promised them, to Egypt. That's how we get out of the original land that God gave to Abram. They are now in Egypt, and after 400 some years, a new king, a new pharaoh arises that does not know Joseph, and he says we have to put them into captivity. So that's just a quick lesson for anybody who didn't understand the link, how we got from having the land that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that we see there, and then they're in Egypt, just so you have that, and so you understand that. So those are some of the key themes we see through the books of the law. We see the creation, we see the introduction of sin, we see the first covenant, and we also see the law. That's simple. With the books of law, they're known as the books of law because they give us the law. We understand the commands and the details that go along with the covenant. Look at it from a legalistic perspective. The covenant is the contract. God has made the contract with Abraham that is going to be continuing down through Abraham's descendants and through Abraham's family, passed all the way down. And with that contract come different stipulations and bylaws and rules and regulations that govern how things have to go so that contract stays valid and is not voided. So that's what we get throughout the books of the law. The 10 Commandments give us the crystallized version of the 10 laws that were established, and many of us see them as the law, but there are also other pieces that go along with it, as we see throughout the books of Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus. We see all of that law continue to be worked out and given to God's people. Then we get into the books of the history. So those are all the books of the law, just a quick summary. If you have any questions on anything that we went over in the books of law, or anything at all, just type them in. If you have any questions on the books of history, type them in on the screen. I know I had a couple that we got from some messages. I put them in to that first piece, so I answered some of those. But if you have any further questions, just send those right on the screen. I'll see them pop up, and I'll answer them as we keep on going. Then we get to the books of history, which are Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. These are the books that give us the history from once the children of Israel come back to the promised land, all the way through exile, and then the return to the promised land. So this is important. This gives us really the meat of the Old Testament. We get the introduction in the books of the law, but the books of history really give us the meat, the foundation of what comprises the Old Testament, because this is when we learn about what happened to and in these times. This is when we learn the stories of the people who led and developed the nations, and also led to the demise and the downfall of the nation of God and God's chosen people. So it starts off, we kick off in Joshua, as Joshua becomes the leader, takes over for Moses, because remember, Moses got frustrated with the people. He did not do what God told him to do. He wanted to hit the rock to show that the water was going to come, because the people were doubting and he was sick of it, but that wasn't what God told him to do. And God said, because of that, you're not going to get into the promised land. So Joshua has risen up. Joshua was one of the 12 spies who went into Jericho to see the promised land into Canaan, and he saw that there might have been some challenges, but God had their back, and he came back along with Caleb and said, we can do it. The other 10 said we can't. The people listened to those 10, and because they listened to those 10, none of them got to see the promised land, but Joshua and Caleb were the only 2 remaining that got to see the promised land. So Joshua takes over for Moses, and we start off as Joshua is leading the people first to cross the Jordan River, then to take command of Jericho. So the crossing of the Jordan River symbolizes the entrance back into the promised land, and the conquering of Jericho is the first conquest of Canaan. That is not the entire promised land, but that's the first conquest in the city that we see. And there's continual conquest throughout the books of history, because we continue to see these battles. So don't get confused. And a lot of times, we've heard this story, we've seen it in little plays and little movies and shows that they've played, like Superbook and things like that. We've seen conquest where they march around for 7 days and then 7 times, and they march around and the walls come tumbling down, and they go in and they take the city and they got it. That's not fully what happened. That was the beginning of it, but that was not full conquest of the entire promised land. That's why it's important to understand why there's all these battles that seem like they keep on happening, because that was just part of it. But God gave them more land than what they walked around for 7 days. God had so much more for them, but because of that, that's why there are more battles to come. There are more people that they have to fight and more people they have to encounter. So that's important that you remember that one point, that they did not drive everybody out on day 1 or in that first week, that there are more people in the promised land that are currently inhabiting the land that God gave them, but they have to address them in their battles to come. And there are different things they're going to experience as they deal with them. So throughout Joshua, we see the stories of some of these conquests. We see how Joshua has led the people into battle and how they're continuing to expand and conquer more of the territory that God's already given them. Joshua gives a farewell speech, and this is in the 24th chapter of Joshua. And this really frames everything from there. The book of Joshua leads us into the promised land and distribution of land within the promised land to 11 of the 12 tribes. The tribe of Levi, or the priests, the Levites, they don't have a territory just for them, because they work in all of the territories, because they are the priests. They are the ones who lead the religious order and religious practice, so they don't have a specific territory, but they function throughout the land. So we see all the tribes divvied up. We see all the land given out and broken up. And Joshua gives an interesting speech, his farewell speech, as is often heard. Many of us have heard one of the famous quotes in it. It says, "As for me, choose ye this day who you will serve. But for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Around chapter 24, around verse 15 or so. And oftentimes we see that and we use that quote. But Joshua is giving his farewell message to everybody, and he's encouraging them to remember God in all things, to keep his commands, keep his laws, because he knows that God is the only reason that they have what they have. And without God, they can lose it all. So Joshua gives that speech. And then after Joshua fades off the scene, after the elders who had been leading under Joshua all fade away and all of them have died and gone on and new people have come to replace them, they begin to fall away. And this is a cycle that we continue to see over and over and over again. Throughout the book of Judges, a judge arrives, God raises up a judge, he leads them back to follow God properly, and then after that, they go away, and then they fall back again. Yes, there are many classes that go over the Old and New Testament in more detail that really hammer in from book to book, not necessarily doing an overview as we're doing a basic. This is an introduction class, but there are more classes at New Psalmist that go into depth that will deal with one book at a time for months, even a whole ministry year, just going through one book. That information is available on newpsalmist.org, so you can get more information on taking this study to the next level. So this was our beginner course. Then we had this, our 101, and we have 201s, 301s, 401s, all at New Psalmist. You can get that information right at newpsalmist.org. And after we finish going through the Bible, it'll take us probably for a good portion, if not the rest of 2016, to go through the rest of the Bible. Then we're going to go to Bible Basics 201, and we're going to take it up a notch and really start to deal with some more themes and dig in, go deeper and deeper. But as for many of you guys, we're laying the foundation, because you can't build the second floor or the first floor until you have that foundation right. So that's what we're doing here in Bible Basics, and I hope you've been blessed and enjoying it as we've gone along since October of last year. So Joshua gives this speech, and they continue to fall away. We continue to see this cycle. We see the cycle of falling away. We see the cycle of punishment, then repentance, and then forgiveness. Then God raises them up. He has mercy on them, raises up a leader, a judge, someone to guide them in to right relationship and right understanding and practice of God's commands. Then after that person fades away, the cycle starts all over. That's called, for those of you who may remember, that is called the Deuteronomic theme, the Deuteronomic cycle, that we continue to see it over and over again. The falling away, the pain, the suffering that comes from it, and then returning back. All of them on YouTube. If you go to YouTube, search Bible Basics, Joshua Thomas, you will see a playlist of all the Bible studies since we started back in October 14th, with our introduction. So if you missed any of them, you can go back and see them all right there on YouTube, on your mobile device, on your computer, on anything. So we see the cycle over and over and over again. And then it comes to a point that we find in 1 Samuel, where the people no longer want judges, but they want kings. And that's where we switch from the monarchy to from the judge to the monarchy. From random judges that God raises up, then we switch over to monarchies, and that's the first king is Saul. We see that in 1 Samuel. Then we see David coming to the throne. After Saul was selected, but Saul did not follow God's command. Saul sinned against God. He didn't do exactly what God told him to do. So God raised up David, and David followed God's commands. David was a man after God's own heart. David loved God. David was always and constantly fighting for God. He had a passion for God. He defended the name of the Lord. He defended God's people. So David became the king, and David is the one through whom God makes a promise with, because David has that heart. David did not do everything perfect. Remember, we talked about this as we studied David. David did not do everything perfect. David had times where he sinned. He fell short with Bathsheba. He fell short in covering that situation up and ultimately leading to Uriah's death. So David did not do everything perfect, but David was a man after God's own heart. We talked about how you don't define character by what people do once or twice. You define character by looking at the totality of who someone is and seeing what they do over and over, seeing constant themes that are repeated in their actions over periods of time. And you can see that sometimes they may mess up, but that does not define who they are. But their character is defined by what they do over and over and over again. Because the reality is, if all of our characters were defined by what we had done in our mistakes, many of us would have been written off a long time ago. But it's what we do in the totality of our actions that the major themes we see rise up. Because we all will sin, so none of us will be perfect. But David had a heart for God, and God made a promise with him, a covenant with him that said once someone from his line would always be on the throne. There would always be someone from the house of David, from the line of David, that would remain on the throne forever. So that's a theme that I don't want you to forget. There's always someone from the house of David that will be on the throne. We'll see that. We'll pick that up in the New Testament. But I want to make sure you remember what the origins of it. Because understanding the origins of it, you will see how, when it picks up in the New Testament, it all works together. So David led United Kingdom, Everybody, Saul was the first king, all of Israel. David, the second king, after 7 years, all of Israel unified. Solomon was the third king, all of Israel unified. Then it splits. That's when we get the northern kingdom, southern kingdom. Northern kingdom's delineated as Israel, southern kingdom as Judah. Then they split. The northern kingdom is always wrong. They are always in opposition to God's command. They never get it right. They build altars because they don't want to go to the southern kingdom to worship. So, and because of that, they're in direct opposition to God. So they are constantly falling away further and further into sin and further into this pit of sin. And that's the problem we have with the northern kingdom. And then in 722, the Syrians come in and completely wipe them off the face of the planet. That's what's known commonly in folklore and commonly in many other usages and many other terminologies. We hear that referred to as the 10 lost tribes because we don't know what happened to them because they were spread out all over. And the Assyrians were an imperial nation. So they took all of them from the northern kingdom and put them at different places in their empire so that they could not there would be no uprising, there would be no cliques, there would be no little groups that would form and try to fight against the empire. They spread them all throughout the Assyrian empire, and because of that, they are all in different places. So we got a question. Need help in understanding why Israel is the chosen land and people. Well, God made his covenant with Abraham, and that was the land he gave them. And so because of that, we see that promised land, and that was in the region which is commonly known in modern day as where Israel is. Part of that region, the modern country of Israel, is not the exact all of the promised land that we see referred to in the Bible, but it is based off of geographical studies. That is, some of that is the general land that we see referred to in the Bible as the land that was given. Now, as you understand, and Israel, the state of Israel was formed in 1948. When it was formed, it was not formed out of the natives necessarily in the area coming together to form the nation of Israel. It was land taken from other nations, other people who also lay claim, religious claim to that land. So because of that, that's where we have a lot of the tensions with the Jews and the Palestinians, because in Islam, that land is also has sacred value and sacred understanding. So that's why there's always constant conflict there. And we see issues with the settlements, issues in the West Bank. I had the privilege 2 years ago to travel to Israel, and as we went through a lot of the land, there are people, one family, we found a Muslim family who had rights to land back to the 1800s. But as the nation of Israel was formed, that began to create many issues, as you can understand, because they had rights to the land since the 1800s. So that's where some of the tensions come from, because it's not as cut and dry as many times, in the United States, we see things one way as understanding, you pass a law, you have what's called eminent domain. If you move somebody out, they may be upset, but they get moved out, get over it, and move on. But that's not how it works all over the world. There's not necessarily one nation that has land that's recognized by every other nation. There's often conflicts in who owns what. So that's where we see some of the issues today. But it's from the geographical understanding of where the promised land was. As you know, nowadays, we look back on the map using archaeological tools and understanding for what's found where certain mountains are believed to have been, based off of what scientists see now and archaeologists will suggest. But it's not an exact science, but we understand it to be in that general region today. So that's how the totality of that land and God's chosen people come. When we get to the New Testament, we start to see a little bit of expansion. The Old Testament, we see God's interaction through the Jewish people. And they are God's chosen people. They are the ones who have access to Yahweh, their God Yahweh. But as we get to the New Testament, we essentially open it up a little bit. That's where a lot of the terms, and I don't want to confuse you guys too much, but I'll just throw it in there. We see the terms Jews and Gentiles come. Gentiles are non-Jews. They are people who aren't born into the Jewish religion or Jewish race. Because remember, the Jew, that's why some of you guys have heard people refer to themselves racially as Jews, is because not only was Judaism seen as a religion, but it's also you're born into it. You're born into it. It's your race as well. You identify yourself religiously as a Jew, racially as a Jew. So when we get to the New Testament, we start to see some expansion, and we start to see the message going out further than the Jewish people. That's where you get to the Apostle Paul. Paul is the ambassador of Christianity to the Gentiles. So I'm going to leave that there. I don't want to drop too much on that. We'll continue in Bible Basics. We're going to get to there. But this is the foundation for it. The northern kingdom, Israel, completely wiped off. The Assyrians has wiped them off. The southern kingdom has a different history. Though many of their kings continue to fall into the cycle, beginning with Solomon. Solomon has all these wives, but all these wives come with different religious practices and understanding. You'll remember, Joshua goes in, they take over Jericho, but I told you there are other battles they have to fight. God instructs them to wipe everybody off that they come into contact with. But in not doing it and not following that command, what they do is allow themselves to be impressed, not necessarily as in they see it in a higher light, but they allow other people's religious practices to leave an impression on them and to mold and shape how they interact with their God, Yahweh, but also begin interacting with these other gods because there's commingling. They don't do as God instructed them to and wipe everybody out. And in not doing that, they're introduced to a plurality of religious understanding that influences and affects the way that they serve their God, but also the way that they understand and carry out the instructions that God has given them. So we see the cycle starting with Solomon, then kings after that continue to fall away. Northern kingdom's gone. Southern kingdom, Judah, has a couple of kings that go back and revert to the right way. We see it with Hezekiah. Then we see it with Josiah, who leads a full rededication to, he finds the book of law, commonly understood as he finds Deuteronomy in the temple. He gets everybody back in the right understanding, but it's too far gone. God promises him that he won't see the destruction, but it's interesting. Josiah dies in battle. He leads these great religious reforms, and then he gets killed in battle. So, is it incorrect to call Jesus Yahweh? I'm gonna tiptoe around this because I don't want to confuse you from a Trinitarian perspective. In our religion, Christianity, we have the triune God. It's one God understood with three persons. The Father, Son, and Holy Ghost are all part of one God. So in referring to Jesus as Yahweh, Yahweh in the Old Testament is what the people, they call God. We call it commonly as God. They refer to God as Yahweh. That was their God. That differentiated their God from other gods. That was the name, the formal name of Yahweh. It was often referred, you don't have any of the vowels written in Yahweh. They did not write the vowels in Yahweh because the name was so sacred and so holy. You could not write it out because it was the name. It was a personal name to God, to their God. And that's our God, the God we understand, and through it that we see revealed in the Holy Scriptures. So, in referring to Jesus as Yahweh is not necessarily incorrect, but depending on the way in which you're using it, it can be misconstrued and misunderstood. So when referring to Jesus, the person of Jesus, the one we found revealed to us in the New Testament, we see as John puts it, the Word became flesh. That's how we understand Jesus. He wrapped himself in human form. So referring to Jesus, we use Jesus to understand, but we also have the understanding of the Trinity, that Jesus is God. So that helps you. I don't want to confuse you too much because as you can understand, dealing with the Trinity, we'll deal with that more as we get into the New Testament. We'll really delve into it, but I don't want to confuse you guys too much on that because sometimes answering that question too much in depth can really open up Pandora's box, and then you walk away from the scope today just saying, I'm completely confused. So we'll get into that. I hope that gave you enough to understand for now, but as we dig deeper and go into the New Testament, we'll definitely spend more time with that. And as I mentioned, as we go higher and higher into different levels of this study, 201, 301, to use those academic understandings, we will dig deeper into that. But for now, I just want to give you that baseline so that you have a general understanding of it, so that you can kind of begin to see where we're going with it. So the southern kingdom is still around, but they have fallen away too, and they have done so much wrong that now they're taken over by the Babylonians as well. That's where we end off in 2 Kings. As we mentioned, the Chronicles is essentially a retelling of the information we have throughout, from really starting up in Genesis, picking up from Noah right on through the destruction of the temple in 587 in Judah. And the chronicler uses the Deuteronomic historians' work, Joshua Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, as his primary source in compiling the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So we see that, and then we see the return when we get into Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah are our only two sources, primary sources of historical information on what life was like after we got back into the promised land, after the return from exile. Though we have some prophets that spoke at those times, Ezra and Nehemiah are the only two books in the Old Testament that provide us historical information and historical data on what life was like for those who returned from the exile. And we see the leading and going back into rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the walls, and beginning to reestablish life for the Jewish people coming back from exile, but also now taking a more religious approach. This is where we're going to end. This is really gives us a good segue. We're going to pick up when we get to New Testament on this, but for some of you guys who know Bible a little bit, this gives us a religious approach. Now, no longer do we have judges, no longer do we have kings, but we have those in religious positions, whether that's priests, whether that's prophets, that are now leading and guiding the way that society interacts, and those who have returned from exile. Some of you guys may say, well, I don't see the link. Well, in the times of Jesus, I'll just drop this on you. Jesus doesn't interact with kings and queens from a Israeli or Israelite kings of Judah. He doesn't interact with them. Jesus interacts with religious leaders, because now the governance, as far as kings and all of that, is not driven by those from Israel or from Judah per se. It's driven by the outside powers that have come in. So we see the Romans in the time of Jesus. Back then we saw the Persian Empire. They're the ones who have come in, and they have essentially allowed the Jews to go back to their hometown. But Jerusalem is a city-state of the Persian Empire. That's where you see the conflict. For those of you in this, I'll go into it because this leads us to where we just finished off in the Christian calendar. Jesus had an issue, and he was saying he's going to destroy the kingdom and rebuild it. They went to the Roman officials saying Jesus is a criminal against the Roman Empire, not a religious empire, but against the Roman Empire, because Jerusalem was a city-state, essentially, in the way of understanding a city-state. They were under Roman rule, the Pax Romana. So they saw Jesus as a threat to peace, not as a threat in religion, because they weren't subscribing to, they didn't believe in Yahweh. They didn't believe in that. So they just see them as their own religious practice. There's a pluralistic understanding of religion. Everybody has a God. So Yahweh, though we understand it as the only true and living God, they just saw it as the God of the Jewish people, and everybody else had their own gods. So everybody had gods. So that's where you start to see a difference, and this is where we see it happen. Because as they've gone back to the promised land, they've gone back from exile, they are under They are essentially under the governance. They are a territory, to use that word. I think that may help some of you guys. The city-state analogy, for those of you who may not have studied Greek history and all, may not help you. They are essentially a territory of a larger nation. They are a territory of the Persian Empire. They are a territory of the Roman Empire. So, within the territory, the religious leaders are the ones who have power. Pharisees. Some of you guys see where we're going. So that's where we start to see this new understanding of who has power in society starting to creep up. And that's where we leave off, as we have now finished through the books of law and finished through the books of history. I hope you guys have enjoyed this journey. I tried to sum it all up in 45 minutes tonight, because I wanted to make sure anybody who picked up within the last couple of weeks or so understood where we were so far. If you were blessed today, or if you've been blessed through any of these, just tap the screen. I just want to see those hearts fly up. Send an emoji with your hand up so I can see where you guys have been blessed, if you guys are really getting in with this, because I've thoroughly enjoyed this, thoroughly appreciated just the time what you guys give to us, that we come in here and get to study God's word and grow deeper in who it is that God has called us to be. So we are going to pick up as we continue our journey throughout the entire Bible. Next, we have the books of wisdom and the books of poetry, which are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Songs of Solomon. Those give us now a different understanding and a different view on some of the things that have happened. The books of history, the books of law, in some ways, give us, general history. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. Now we're going to start to see some of the works that have come out of those that were living through those books that we read about in those books of history. We're going to see some of the things that David wrote that give us insight into what David was thinking, that what his character was like. Some of the things that Solomon gave us that give us insight and understanding to who he was. So now we're going to start transitioning and building off of this. Then when we get to the books of the major prophets and minor prophets, we'll start to see what some of the prophets were saying at the time that we read about in history. So now we have a context. That's what the books of history and the books of law even are simply there to do, is to give us context. Because without the context, we don't understand anything else that happened. So now we have the context and we can build upon it. And you will even begin to see, for even those who have had a Bible study before and know a little bit about the Bible beyond the introductory level, you will see that with the proper context, you'll start to understand some of these books more. You'll start to understand what was going on with David. You'll understand what Solomon was saying and the context in which he was living. You'll understand what the prophets were prophesying and why they were saying it at a certain time and who they were saying it to. Why the northern kingdom's prophecies are different than those that went to the southern kingdom. Why different people were prophets to different nations and not prophesying to everybody, because it was different needs at different times. So we're going to get to all of that. So I hope you've been blessed. Don't forget to register, and we'll get your ticket rather for the Millennial Happy Hour. If you're between the ages of 18, hey, Miss Kimmons, glad you're on with us. Between the ages of 18 and 33, you can go right to well, let me get the link right. Excuse me. That's m2hh.eventbrite.com. Get your ticket, free ticket for the happy hour. We want to fill that place up with millennials coming out just to connect with each other, talk about some of the things that we're all dealing with as we seek to live this Christian journey and live this life right, so that we can be who God has called us to be, even at a young age. Because I believe that you don't have to be old to be who God calls you to be. But even at the millennial age, you can start to walk in your calling. So, hope to see you there. Once again, that link is m2hh.eventbrite.com. So until next week, hope to see you Sunday as we celebrate our pastor's 41st pastoral anniversary at New Psalmist. And again, all of these lessons are up on our YouTube channel. Go to youtube.com. Just search Bible Basics Joshua Thomas. You'll see the playlist with all the sessions right there. So until next week, be blessed. Talk to you guys soon.